to today's session. I'm Arzu and I look after the marketing at Cloud2. For those of you who don't know us, we streamline organizations' information, data and processes into one end-to-end digital workspace. Simon, can you put your screen on, please?
There it goes.
Thank you very much. So today we're presenting content and collaboration in Office 365 in collaboration, pardon the pun, with ClearBox Consulting. We've got two speakers for you today, Sam Hudson from Cloud2 and Sam Marshall of ClearBox Consulting. Simon, if you'd like to tell us a little bit about yourself, please, and if you can move to the next screen as well.
Absolutely. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm one of the directors at Cloud2, and when I did the maths, it turns out I've been playing around with intranets and knowledge management for 21 years, not just within Cloud2, but in two previous, maybe even three previous companies. So I founded Cloud2 about 9 years ago with my my partner Karen Sohal, which some of you may know. I'm one of the facilitators at the SharePoint user group up in Yorkshire. And Cloud2, we think that we were the first organisation to formally launch what's currently being called an out-of-the-box SharePoint intranet. And my background is not at all IT, strangely enough. I've got physics and medical devices and all these other strange things that you have on there, and almost no IT whatsoever. And Cloud2, just to give you that tiny bit of advertising that, that we get at the front of these sessions, as you'd expect, we specialize in digital workplaces, especially intranet portals, applications that run on that space, and increasingly the business processes that support them. So we also have a business analytics or business intelligence practice, and we specialize in Office 365 and Azure, and we've got some pretty neat clients.
Thank you very much, Sam. Thank you, Sam.
Hello, everybody, and I'm Sam Marshall. I'm the director and owner of ClearBox Consulting. I'm a mere youngster. I've only been 18 years in the internet and digital workplace space compared to Simon. My background is a mixture of communications, knowledge management, and enough IT to blag my way through those technical conversations. In total, I've probably consulted about 100 intranets now, but I cut my teeth as the digital and internet workplace manager at Unilever. So as ClearBox, we focus on the non-technical side of intranets, by which I mean we don't sell any technologies or install SharePoint or Office 365, but we tend to partner with the business owners to help them work out what the strategy for their digital workplaces should be, how to get strong adoption, how to get the governance right, and run that in parallel with technology changes like implementing a new intranet. One of the things that we do is a report called SharePoint Intranets in a Box. Cloud2 is one of the products that we review within that report. And for listeners of the webinar, we've got a discount code. If we can flip to the next slide, please, Simon. If you go to clearbox.co.uk and put in the code C2, as in Cloud2 Web 10, then you'll get 10% off. So this is a comprehensive review of 26 in-a-box add-ons to SharePoint that make it look more like a consumer-grade portal or intranet.
Thank you very much, Sam. So before we start, I'll just go through some housekeeping. Firstly, a recorded version of this webinar will be emailed to you tomorrow, and the presentation slides will also be available on SlideShare in the next few days. You'll also notice on the panel there is a section that says handouts, and the handouts for today's presentations are also on there, which you are free to download. So we'd love to hear from you, so please post your questions and we'll get Simon and Sam to answer them as we go, rather than all at the end. The hashtag for today's event is Make O365 Work, so please all share your thoughts and comments using this. For those of you joining us, welcome to our webinar, Content and Collaboration in Office 365 with Cloud2 and ClearBox Consulting. Simon, if you can go to the next slide, please. So you've all probably heard a couple of words in the last over 18 months or so, digital transformation being bandied around, and Microsoft is playing a major part in helping its customers transform digitally, and for many the starting point is Office 365. They've had great success with Office 365, with almost 1/3 companies using it, and with 2/3 of users using SharePoint. So with that, what we like to do is launch our first poll for today, and my question for you today is, where are you with Microsoft Teams on Office 365? If you can please take a minute or so to answer that.
Well, this is very exciting for us because we can see these results coming in real time, so marvellous.
Okay, we'll just give it a few more seconds and then we'll close the poll. Yeah, please everyone keep your votes coming in. We'll just give it a few more seconds and then we'll close the poll. So the results are in and it actually looks like, I'll just show you the screen, that we have 32% of people using them a little bit, 28 on who've had a play around, and there's a 19% of you who haven't even tried them yet. So that's really good insight for us and thank you very much for that. So Simon, over to you now to start today's webinar.
Okay, marvellous. Right, so hopefully you can all see the screen again. If you can't see the screen, please somebody put a question up really quickly so that I don't start talking without you being able to see what we're sharing. That's excellent. So we're not going to go through the introduction, we've already covered that. What I want to do is reflect a bit on the complexity of Office 365. It used to be back in the day that we all just had SharePoint to worry about, and that was challenging enough really, because that's quite a big application. But today, if you're in Office 365, there's something like 14 discrete, definitely part of Office 365 components, and that's without including things like Dynamics and projects and other things that Microsoft are sneaking in under the Office 365 brand. When we look at those 14 items, you see that one way or another, an awful lot of them are to do with content and collaboration. In fact, by my count, you can easily attribute 9 of those to being content and collaboration technologies. So the question stops being, how do I use SharePoint to do my content and collaboration, and becomes a rather more provocative, what the hell am I meant to use out of 365 to do content and collaboration? And that's what I want to dwell on a fair bit during my half of today's session. Just to try and get that whole conversation started, we've taken a look at those different elements of 365, cross-referenced against what we term the 5 pillars of enterprise intranet, so enterprise digital workplaces. So these 5 things are communication, collaboration, content, business process, and people, which we think underpin every organization, regardless of what domain you're in. We've tried to work out where the different parts of 365 sit in that. And so for each of them, we've given them one sort of home column, or one home row. So you'll see that SharePoint Online sits for us initially in the content row, but the vertical bars tell you where it reaches into. So SharePoint's really interesting because it covers content and collaboration, has got a role to play in communication, although it's not as strong in communication as some other tools. It has a big role to play in business process. We argue that it doesn't really have much to do with people, but there are other parts of the stack that attend to that. If I look at OneDrive for Business as a counter argument, OneDrive for Business is primarily about storing content, but it has some capability of providing collaboration around that content. And so you can see, I'm not going to go through every item, otherwise we'll be here all day, and you've got the slides, but you can see how we've tried to position this. And it's helpful, we think, when we start to consider teams and groups, because they seem to be primarily a collaboration tool, whereas SharePoint, for example, is primarily a content tool with reach into other domains. Because we've only got a limited amount of time today, I'm not going to go through all of the different elements in 365. What we're going to do is really focus in initially on SharePoint, groups, teams, bit of OneDrive, and touch on a few other things. And we're going to really focus on the content and collaboration elements of those, and that'll be enough to keep us going right through until when I hand over to Sam. So let's carry on with this particular story and think more about this debate of, well, why do we have SharePoint sites, Office 365 groups, and Microsoft Teams? Why have we got three, and which of these should I choose for which job? So let's start with SharePoint. I'm going to make an assumption that most of us have got some knowledge of SharePoint, but at the heart of SharePoint, at least by one measure, is a set of features built around lists of information, libraries of documents, web pages, the ability to have embedded calendars, which is really a sort of special kind of a list, sites that draw all of these items together, and then with some overlaying portal capabilities such as search. And the thing that we really like and have really cut our teeth on over the decades is the fact that SharePoint allows organizations to have a high degree of structure and control in what they do. And where you need structure and control, that's a fabulous thing. As those of you that follow the technology closely will know, Microsoft have been playing around with the purpose of SharePoint quite a lot. There was a point at which it looked like they might actually wind SharePoint out of the equation a bit because people recognize it's quite a complicated beast. And instead of winding it out, they've done a couple of things. They've brought in the idea of groups and teams, which we'll talk about more in a moment, but they've also tried to simplify some of the experiences in SharePoint. And so now we have the classic SharePoint, which is Microsoft's term as well as ours, and the new modern sites and modern experiences. And so if you haven't played with those are really interesting. They're super fast. They offer a simpler user experience. They have some capabilities that don't exist in classic SharePoint and vice versa. And they have some things where they've, I would argue, dumbed it down, but maybe with good purpose. So modern parts of SharePoint are really great where you need speed, you need ease of use, you've got simpler needs, but you want to be able to then grow from those needs into more sophisticated stuff. And we talk about these all being SharePoint sites. So that's our terminology. These are SharePoint sites. I'm just going to try and show you one of those sites. I'm going to try and pull up a SharePoint modern site for you, just so if you haven't seen a modern site previously, you get a sense of that. Let me go and drag this guy in from my Edge browser, assuming Edge is behaving well. So this is a modern SharePoint site. This is one of their newly much vaunted communication sites. Strangely, it's not a communication site for the comms department. It's a site designed to allow organizations to do really strong, sort of visually impactful sort of communications-based sites, but it doesn't have to be owned by comms. It can be an HR team or an IT team or anybody else trying to communicate to the rest of the organization, how lovely and wonderful they are. So they've got this great hero web part, which is a really strong visual component with click-throughs and the ability to very easily and quickly generate content on these pages. They even now have a commenting box built right in. I'm going to just very rapidly take you into the edit mode on this, just so you can see what that feels like. You can see that it's super quick. I do have a very fast internet connection, which is nice, but even without that, these pages are super quick to use. So I'm already in edit mode. I can go and edit this individual component, pulls up a component on the right hand side where I can swap around my my look and feel for this individual component. I can even change it from a tiled to a sort of a row-based layer approach. I can whiz down, look at the content area that I've got with my text, and then if I want to add some more things in, I can very easily do that from this new type of web part browser. So again, we're kind of familiar with the idea of web parts in SharePoint, but this is the way it happens in modern pages. So I can write, right, I really want to add in a highlighted content component. There it is, and automatically pull in some blocks of content that are probably related to this site. And from this, it will give me the most recently updated documents or my documents and all sorts of clever things right in the heart of these pages. When I'm happy with it, I hit publish, and you can see that that was done. That's a super quick experience compared with traditional or classic SharePoint. And there's lots more of this this capability around these modern sites. This is not, however, a modern site exploration. It's more of a what do I use where seminar. So I'm going to move on from there onto the next part of the equation. So let's think about groups. Office 365 groups, or groups as I like to call them, really started out as Outlook groups and were definitely built by the Microsoft Exchange team. So think about groups as being really an Exchange distribution list which is now on steroids. So they upped it from a distribution list into a sort of a smarter kind of people group, and then added in sharing capabilities and some other features on top. So right now, Office 365 group has these left-hand side components. It has a shared inbox. It has a SharePoint site. And it really is a SharePoint site. It's one of those modern sites, but it's in a strange place in SharePoint. It's in a hidden site collection. And every time I create a new group, I create another hidden site collection. It has a shared calendar, which is really good if you're using shared calendars, which many organizations do. It has a built-in notebook. Well, that notebook is OneNote, which is one of our favorite parts of Office, and that OneNote notebook is stored within the SharePoint site. And it has access to the newish Microsoft Tool Planner, which if you haven't played with, is a really nice, lightweight sort of activity planning tool. And you can get to Office 365 groups through a number of mechanisms. One of the most obvious, and really where it started, was through Outlook. So I'm going to pull in my my Outlook 2016 client, is my desktop client, and right here within Outlook 2016, you can see, here we go, my inbox, which I'm not going to show you because you never know what's in there. Here is a list of some of my active groups within my portal. Here is the shared email conversation for that group, but you can see up here access to the shared calendar, access to the files area for this particular group, and to the notebook. Let's just get rid of that and go hunting for the browser equivalent of that. And of course I now have far too many browsers open, but let's just drag that in. So here's the browser equivalent. You know, very similar because Microsoft done a great job of bringing together the browser experience with the desktop experience. So shared email, files, calendar, notebook. And if I click on this ellipsis, you can see there's Planner, and this is important. That is your SharePoint site. So let's briefly look at that. In fact, let's just do it the long way around. Why don't I just click on it and let that open up? I have got this preloaded, but yeah, you can see that it works. This is not a terribly exciting site because we're not using this site very actively for this seminar, but you can see just automatically it generated me a brand new modern site with a news feed at the top and some activity stuff and many other things. Completely automatic. It's a proper SharePoint site, and I can get into the rest of the SharePoint capability. This is a simple SharePoint site, so there's no metadata and content types and all the other clever things that we may use in SharePoint, but I can escalate the capabilities within this site if I want to do that. So that's 365 groups. You can get to it through these different routes, through the desktop client, the web access client, through the mobile client, and indeed through apps on all the popular phones. I probably need to cross Windows Phone out now, sadly. It also has direct integration with Yammer, so when you create a Yammer group, it does create a 365 group, and they recently enabled groups to give you internal and external guest access, so it can be used for people outside your organization if you wish to do so.
Simon, if I can just interject, one thing I heard from Jeff Teeper is that the Groups app for iOS and Android is going to be retired. So I'm guessing that they're trying to make people move more to the Outlook app.
That would be entirely consistent with some of the things I'm going to say, but thank you for that. I didn't hear that from Jeff so far, but it's entirely consistent. I mean, also while we're on the question of retirement, you saw briefly that on this there is the new modern site news, and that is now being pulled into the SharePoint app, but that does mean that they have retired the old SharePoint news feed. So that app is now gone, and if you want to have news appearing on your mobile phone, you need to be using these new modern pages for now. So there you go, it's a little sidebar for everybody. Right, so one of the things that we just need to be aware of is that the UI, especially the one within Outlook, is not extensible. So if you do clever things on the back-end SharePoint site, or add other stuff into the SharePoint side of it, including adding columns and metadata, you won't see that in the Outlook client. So you just need to think about that. The front-end experience in Outlook, etc., is quite simple. Let's look at Teams, because I promised that we would. So Teams is very similar. When you look at that list of things it does on the left-hand side, you'll see that, again, it has a SharePoint site, it has a notebook. There are some differences, though. It doesn't have email. Instead, Teams is really much more like Slack in that it uses a real-time chat interface, which, you know, when I wrote this presentation a week ago, I said it was very Skype-ish. Of course, since then, Microsoft announced that they're actually integrating Skype for Business increasingly directly into the Microsoft Teams, and we can anticipate the current Skype for Business client disappearing and being replaced with the Microsoft Teams client, which I'll show you in a moment. A couple of the things that are in there by default is a wiki, and there's this interesting thing around add-ins and connectors that I'll show you in a moment. You can get to Teams directly from the Office 365 waffle menu, so there is a Teams browser variant, and there's the URL for that if you want to fire that up. But they also, as you've probably now intimated, there is a desktop application for that. Let me go and see if I can find the desktop app. There it is. So this is a full universal Windows client. Therefore, I mean, you can install it on, you know, mobile devices as well as on Windows 10, and it shows you, in my case, a bunch of mostly test sites for using Teams in this particular tenant. Teams are slightly different. Here's that chat element. But you can also see that it has this concept of channels. So you can create sub-channels within a master area. Think of these as being really like folders within your file structure, etc. But they have their own unique chat sections for them. So you can have a master team with a bunch of sub-folders or sub-channels. But you can also have access to the file browser. So there's the file browser. This content lives in a library in SharePoint, and we might even see that in a minute. So much so that I can click on that and open it natively in SharePoint. There's a wiki. The wiki is not the full SharePoint wiki, strangely enough, which means you don't get all the wiki features, and I wonder where they're going to go with that. Right now, we think this is pretty basic, but you know, that's part of the argument. It's simple and quick. You can also add new stuff in. So if I click on this guy here, you can see this is a whole range of, you know, sort of what Microsoft would argue is best of breed external applications. Many of them are third-party applications, but up near the top, there is a chunk of Microsoft applications, including SharePoint. If I was to click on the SharePoint one, that would let me go and select some content from my SharePoint tenant and add it in. So in this case, I've added in the link to a corporate documents library in one of the sites in SharePoint, which is not necessarily the same site that this tissue viability service is built on. Hopefully that makes sense, but maybe if I show you what that site looks like, it'll clarify things. Here is the underlying SharePoint site, which has been created by that team. And it's a modern site. This is a modern library in that site with all of the modern library capabilities. But you can see on the left-hand side, it's pre-populated my site with, with a bunch of tools. This is where it now gets interesting. You can see that it has a thing called conversations. So I'm in a Microsoft Teams created site, which is the browser version of that thing there. But when it spun it up, it has created a tab called Conversations, and that is an Office 365 groups conversation. So if I click on that, it'll take me into the 365 group experience. So you've got this increasing level of integration between groups, teams, and sites, and they're not quite the same, but they're getting there. So
you use interesting in a very generous way there, I think, Simon. When you say it's conversations, I would expect it to go into the conversation on Teams, but it isn't. It's the email discussion in the group, isn't it?
Yes, and I'm going to just touch on that a bit more, but you know, I mentioned earlier that Groups was built by the Exchange team, and Teams is not. Teams is built by a different team, and a year ago this was a complete mess. There were 3 completely separate applications that just happened to use some of the same capabilities. Jeff Tepper has been forcing the teams to work together, and bit by bit they're getting closer and closer in terms of their capability.
When you're ready, we're getting some good questions coming in. So
I'll take a look at those in a moment. Super.
I'll read them out when you're ready. Yeah.
And try not to overrun, which is my natural behaviour. So the moment that the story is less confused than it was, but I still think there is some element of confusion around which bits to use for what. So and I think I mentioned earlier, it's just really important to remember that when you move into the team experience, it isn't always obvious how you get back out into the 365 experience. So here's the team client, but there's no 365 in there. If I was to open up the, let me shift that guy over there. If I go and click on this link, if I was to actually open up that team directly in Microsoft Teams in the browser, unless they've changed it in the last week, here you see it loading Teams. They do that for me. It's been quite common for me to say a thing and then a week later it's not true. No, here we go. So this is that same thing running in the browser, but where the heck is my Office 365 toolbar? So you've just got to be a little bit careful if you're rolling these out. It's kind of great if you just want a simple experience and people not to be overwhelmed with all the new cool stuff that is in 365. It sucks a bit if they want to actually jump from here back into the common experience. And sort of the way to get that is to go from here into SharePoint and then go from SharePoint back into 365. So yeah, there's got some work to do, but there's some great capability in here. Right, moving forward. So I've said it a couple of times now. This is what the picture looks like right now. Overlapping capabilities, but some distinct stuff. We're seeing this happening right now. They're getting closer and closer together, and it wouldn't surprise me if we don't get completely overlapped technology with three different user experiences, but one common set of capabilities across teams, groups, and sites. And I think that would be a great place for us to reach. Just very quickly, there are a couple other places these things manifest, especially groups. So we've touched on you can get to groups from Outlook, so I won't show you that again, but you can get to groups from OneDrive. And that's kind of a bit weird. But if I go and fire up my OneDrive, let me just pull that up in the background. I'm going to launch this slide briefly while I really show you. On the right-hand side, there's the Outlook client, but on the left-hand side, this is a snapshot of my my OneDrive for Business, and you can see there access to all of my sites, all the sites that I have access to across SharePoint and OneDrive for Business are now showing up in the OneDrive for Business experience. And if I was to click on this More Sites link, it'll take me into that full sort of SharePoint, these are all your sites experience. I'm going to show you that again very briefly. Let's have a look at this one here. Here's the full list of my sites, and if I go and click on this communication site that we saw briefly earlier, that is the SharePoint list or SharePoint library from that communication site that was generated by the Office 365 group. Complex, I know. So, what do we do about that?
Simon, maybe this is a good time to interject with one of Anna Groning's questions. Apologies, Anna, if I mispronounced your name. So, as an administrator, is there a way to get a listing of all the team sites and groups being created?
You know, that is a cracking question and one that we've been much vexed by. So here's the answer right now, is that groups are shown to an administrator directly through the Office 365 portal. There is a group section within the O365 portal that will give you that. So that's kind of good. The story around teams is less clear, but what happens now is if you have a team or are able to manage, sorry, if you have a group and manage groups and you then try and create a team, at the point at which you create a new team, it'll say you have the ability to do groups. Do you want to connect this new team up to one of your existing groups or create it as a standalone? So the reality is whenever you create a team, Microsoft team, it does create a group. And you can now connect these things to an existing Office 365 group, or it'll create one invisibly in the background. So that will now appear in that list of groups in the O365 portal. However, if you're a user and you want to say, can you show me a list of all the teams and groups I've got access to, right now there is no native way within SharePoint, for instance, to see those. And it's a little bit of a mess. Equally, if I was to go into this More Sites experience, let me just see if I can do that for you, because it is a great question, one that we struggle with a lot within the company. This is my sort of all sites view, but actually it doesn't tell me all my sites. It shows me the sites I'm following, and it will probably give me some recommended sites if I do the go to SharePoint Home. So here's my frequent sites, news for my sites, suggested sites, but nowhere does it just give me a nice list of every site that I've got access to. And so right now the best way to do that is to actually create a query within SharePoint, and there's a way of doing that, a search or a query that shows me all the sites that I have permissions for. So interesting. Like I say, they haven't quite joined all the dots yet.
They certainly haven't. A related question from Terry Smith, and they've currently got a very large set of SharePoint sites with team sites underneath. So when they migrate into Office 365, they're just going to appear underneath that SharePoint tab that you just showed, aren't they?
That is correct. And that's not a bad place to be.
They don't trigger teams or groups, they just stay as SharePoint sites. So
no, absolutely. Yeah, right now you cannot convert a SharePoint site into a team or a group, but what you can do right now, and is probably going to happen automatically is if you've got any Exchange distribution lists, they will be turning those into groups. So I'm not sure that helps, but that's what they're doing. But they're focusing on that and not converting existing sites. Who knows what will happen right now? In future. Right now, you can turn a classic SharePoint site kind of into a modern site. You can start turning on modern features, but it won't spontaneously generate a group off the top of it. Not yet.
Yeah. And perhaps it's worth emphasizing that you still can create a good old-fashioned SharePoint team site on its own without triggering anything else if you want to.
And I think you're going to talk a bit about that later, Sam. I think that's a really important thing to dwell on, is when do you want to use a group or a team? When do you want to use a classic site? And I think, I've got some advice on that, and Sam has the same that we'll come to in a minute. They both have their place.
Yes.
Are there any other questions that we ought to address? I'm just having a...
So just a clarification, another one from Anna. So when you create a Yammer group, an Office 365 group is also created and a team. So I think it is confusing, so it's maybe worth just spelling that one out again.
So when you create a Yammer group, it does create a Office 365 group on the background, because the Yammer now uses effectively Exchange distribution lists in their new group guys to manage who's in those groups. And so it's quite easy for it to create a group off the back of that. So I'm just trying to see if I've got an example of that I can show you, which doesn't have too much proprietary information in it.
Well, while Simon looks for that, let me respond to Rachel Benton's question, which is, what do you use the Wiki for? Rachel, my personal opinion is that the Wiki is no use at all, so don't use it for anything. Use OneNote instead, because for that level of collaboration you have in a team, OneNote is much more versatile.
I would have said exactly the same, Sam. So we're completely aligned on that. Yes, OneNote just beats the Wiki hands down. So, no, I can't easily show you that. But when you create a new Yammer group, it gives you the ability to create a Office 365 group off the back of it. But I don't want to demo that right now because I'm going to give away stuff that I probably shouldn't be showing people.
So Liz, Simon, we've got one question from Liz as well. She's saying, we're keen to switch on Teams for our organisation of nearly 15,000 people. Any tips for things we should be doing in preparation for that? How about ways to provision and ensure there is no duplication?
Right, okay, so that's actually also a cracking question, and one of the limitations, let me just jump back on my slide deck rather than getting into this rather sophisticated slide. One of the main limitations that we see around both groups and teams right now is that they lack any of that governance process that you would expect to find within a SharePoint environment. So you haven't really got visibility of who's creating what. You can see who's built it, who's created a group, for instance, but you don't really get any other insights as a portal administrator than the fact that a group exists and that a named person created it. So you don't see when it's created, you don't get insights into how often it's being used. There's no mechanism to prevent creation of duplicate groups at the moment. So our recommendation is put in place a strong governance process for people creating groups. We really like groups and teams. The ability to spin these things up by end users in demand to needs really quickly is fabulous, but it has to be tinged with a sense of governance. And what we are tending to tell people is maintain a master list of all the groups that are being spun up, and get your end users as a matter of policy to put any new sites they create into that master list, or submit a email with that URL and name and purpose to that list. At the moment there's no way to catch them and beat them with a stick if they don't do that, but at least you can encourage them to do the right thing until Microsoft catch up with the maturity. And then the flip side is go through your Office 365 portal groups list from time to time and try and catch the offenders and have a gentle word with them. But it is an issue, is lack of governance. I think also, and I'm going to come on to this right away actually, is have a real clear decision on when to use teams and groups as opposed to some other collaboration technology. So let me step to that right now, because that's actually the heart of what I wanted to get to with this, having shown you what the technologies are. This is my, as you can see, super simple process for deciding which parts of the massive Office 365 suite you're going to use for content and collaboration. And because we're on a limited amount of time, I won't go into it in as much detail as I might otherwise because you've got the slides. But this is a really elegant flow diagram, which I have to also just call out that the folks at Tata Steel who contributed heavily to this as they were doing some similar thinking. To say which part of the suite am I going to use. And you can follow each of these different tracks down. So just call out a few of those for you. So I've created a new document and I need to decide who I'm going to share that with. And frankly, if I'm not going to share it with anybody, the simple solution is stick it in my OneDrive. And I'm going to show you another side on that in a moment. Stick it in OneDrive, that's fine. It's not for anybody else's use. If I only want to share it with a few people, maybe my immediate team or a project group or something, then I've got some further decisions to make. Am I going to keep this document for a very short period of time? In which case, there's a question about, am I only using it for internal people or am I going to send it externally? If it's a really passing ephemeral document, that's actually a pretty good use for email. Whether you email the document as an attachment or a link, I'll leave for another conversation. But if it's for internal use, actually a short-term document, storing it in my OneDrive is also a good plan. If it's going to be kept in the long term, then there's a different question. Same thing about internal or external users. If it's external users, I'd recommend building a specific extranet rather than accidentally sharing internal stuff with external users. I think you'll be really careful about that. But if it's a relatively short-term document and it's going to be not for managed collaboration, it's just something I'm going to share with my immediate team, then a good place for that would be a team or a group. So think about teams and groups as being not in the long term and fairly ad hoc and not requiring a massive amount of process around it or document lifecycle management around it, because teams and groups don't have that out of the box. But if you do need lifecycle management, if you're doing document control and document management, then you probably are better off using a SharePoint site. So that would be an intranet SharePoint site giving you managed collaboration.
I'm going to nudge you to move on if I can, please, Simon.
Yes, absolutely. Right. So you can have a look at this diagram at your leisure. I'm just going to jump down into the OneDrive very quickly. If you're going to use OneDrive, we recommend setting up a structure a lot like this, with a private area, a number of team areas, a shared with everybody in the organization area, and then a separate area with subfolders for any external partners that you're sharing with. So that's how we would recommend you set up your OneDrive. Right, so that diagram was really complicated. I invite you to look at it in your leisure, but actually it comes down to sort of 5 simple rules. So, keep your own stuff in OneDrive. If you're going to do team and project collaboration, and by team in this case I mean a department share or something like that, then you could probably put it in a SharePoint site. But if it's short term, you can use Teams or Office 365 groups if you don't need sophistication. And we see lots of smaller organizations using Teams and groups, lots of big organizations setting up proper SharePoint sites for their department shares. If you want to publish something, then push it out to a news site or a document center or something structured in SharePoint where you've got strong permissions and people aren't allowed to change stuff very easily. Alternatively, if it's not really around sharing and collaborating on a document, but sharing or collaborating on an idea, we'd probably use Yammer for that. External stuff should use an external tool, such as an extranet, maybe even Yammer again, and some cases very carefully using OneDrive for Business. And again, if it isn't a document, then think about using Yammer, but also use Skype if it's really real time, and if you absolutely must, use email, but try not to use email for anywhere where you can use one of these other tools, because it's actually a broken tool in modern business. And actually, if you're thinking that's too complicated, don't panic. Our view is, for users, they only have to think about 5 things. They've got my stuff. And if it's mine, I'm going to store it in OneDrive. If it's my team's stuff, if it's mine and belongs to the team I work with, let's put it in my team site, whether that's a SharePoint site, a group, or a Microsoft team, but it goes in whatever that defined team site is. Similarly, if it belongs to a project, stick it in the project site. If it belongs to the organization as a whole, we'd suggest you've probably got a proper set of places in your SharePoint intranet which has got things like corporate policies or corporate news, and those things are probably well structured, well managed, and that's the right place for them. If it's anything else, it's probably not their problem. You know, almost everything else falls into, this is a job that I need to pass to somebody else, and it will be their personal stuff or their corporate stuff as opposed to yours. So my stuff, my team stuff, project stuff, corporate stuff, and somebody else's problem is the way that we tend to think about this. Right, so that's actually the end of my session. I invite you to look at the slides and get your head around what it is that I've just confused you with. But for now, what I'd like to do is try and show you another poll. And can you fire the poll up from here, Arzu, or do I need to try and find it?
I can do it now.
Great.
So our next poll is, what's your organization's plan for OneDrive? So if you can please answer that for us. Just give it a few more seconds and then we'll close the poll down. So I'm just going to close that now.
Oh, hang on, we're only at 37%. So.
Yeah, we're running out of time, Simon.
Okay, fine.
So those are the results from the poll. So the majority of you, it looks like you think it's useful, but you're not really too sure how best to use it. But hopefully Sam's presentation will now help you understand that a little better. Over to you now, Sam.
No pressure then. Thank you very much. Have I got
You're welcome.
Am I driving? Yes. No, not quite.
I'm just about to give you that now. There you go. You now have the ability to drive, Sam.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you, Simon. So I think that was a really useful overview of what the tools can do. And Simon started to talk about how to fit them together and make choices across using multiple tools. And I want to carry on with that theme and talk about some of the patterns of usage. And I thought I'd start with a couple of real-world examples. The first one is from Velux, who make skylights. So you might have looked up and seen them one day. And this is a case study that's on the ClearBox website if you're interested. What Velux were doing was consolidating the entire company. So they wanted to create a company that felt more like a single entity rather than lots of separate regions. And they rolled out a digital workplace to reflect and reinforce that sense of it being one Velux. So as you can imagine, people were going through an awful lot of change. And although collaboration tools helped them communicate and work across the boundaries, there's also that risk that it felt like it was more confusion, more things going on. So Velux did something which I think was very smart, which is to say, look, just because we've got all of Office 365, it doesn't mean that we have to switch everything on. Let's have a look at the Office 365 elements that make sense for us as a starting point. And later on, we can always switch other functionality on and make it available maybe to only parts of the organization if they've outgrown what we've given them. So they actually picked on 5 technologies: Skype for Business, Yammer, Outlook, OneDrive, and SharePoint team sites, plus Velux One, which was SharePoint portal running as a global intranet. And they said we're going to describe it across 2 dimensions: connecting, communicating, collaborating, and the scale of what's happening to a number of participants from a few to everyone. So they handed out this matrix basically saying, look, if you're doing things at a large scale, then we can use Skype online meetings. Everything else happens on the portal. If you're doing things in a more local way, then Yammer is a good option, not for everybody, but for large groups. Team and project sites for sharing across large groups. My second example is from Lundbeck. And Lundbeck is a Danish pharmaceutical company. And again, if you go to the ClearBox website, there's a case study about what they did to roll out their digital workplace. But the thing that I've highlighted here is a crib sheet that they created. And what was nice about Lundbeck's approach is that they had coaches, mentors that actually went and sat with project teams and listened to their meetings and listened to how they were planning to communicate and collaborate with each other, and then advised by saying, oh, you know, you're going to send out that as an email attachment. Maybe actually we could encourage you to use this OneDrive tool that we have, put it on there and send out a link so everybody has a single version of the truth. What they did with this sheet is to try and encourage a sense of understanding how to match complexity of collaboration with the cost of the interaction. So on the left, what you can see is the most costly interactions are face-to-face meetings, fairly costly web and video conferencing, right down to low cost like email, and bless them, they even had written letters in there. And then match to the complexity of what you're trying to achieve. So if it's just sharing facts and information, that's relatively simple. But if you need to negotiate, to do complex problem solving, the complexity goes really high. And then message to their organization was, look, there's a sweet spot here where if you match low information sharing costs with low complexity and save high information sharing costs for highly complex tasks, then we can use the tools in the optimum way. So Liz Isherwood, hello Liz, thank you for your question about rolling out Teams. I think the question that you need to ask is, where does Teams fit in a chart like this? And we can start, I think, to map on some of the more modern Office 365 tools into this pattern as well. So things like SharePoint and OneDrive down at the file sharing end. Teams itself, I think, is really interesting because it's spanning quite a few blocks here. It's saying it's not just instant messaging, but it's also, you can say, let's start off having a chat and then realize it would be better doing voice or video calling or even screen sharing as a way to have a richer level of interaction without going into a separate tool. And that to me is why it makes a great deal of sense for Microsoft to say Teams is going to swallow Skype for Business eventually within this. So those are two concrete examples. Now to get more into the abstract level. This is a planning tool that I've used with a number of clients over the years. And what we do is we chart your collaboration landscape. So dimensions this time, duration of collaboration. Simon started to talk about that in his last slide with the 5 things in it. So some collaboration only happen for minutes. And then you can say, arbitrarily, there's a suitability scale. So phone, great for short calls. It rapidly tails off as you get on a call that lasts several hours because your ear gets hot and people get fidgety, and doing everything by voice is quite hard. Something like Skype enriches it because you can do desktop sharing and video. When it's more enduring, then things like OneDrive over days and weeks become handy because you've got a reference point. But OneDrive, again, its suitability starts to tail off because you'll find that OneDrive, people don't put metadata around it. For example, there's a long-term storage. It's very hard to come back to a OneDrive folder maybe 2 months later and find things unless you're very well organized. So that's where things like SharePoint starts to come in, because you can have, a much more organized document repository. But you maybe wouldn't create a SharePoint team site for a collaboration that only lasts for days because there's that overhead in setting it up. Something like Teams, a bit quicker to set up, but again, it probably gets messy over time. Yammer, perhaps more enduring as a format for conversations because it tends to be more stable communities. So the homework for this is to say, if you drew what the landscape looked like that you were providing in your organization, do you see any points where there are big gaps? Because if you see the gaps where there's nothing really suitable, that's what encourages employees to start going into the cloud with their own credit card and looking for solutions that they can introduce. So if you're not introduced OneDrive, you'll often see Dropbox coming in because people, they see the need, so they solve it themselves. So the final model I wanted to show you to help you thinking pulls away a bit from a tool-focused way of looking at this and moves more into a work-oriented perspective of what people are trying to do. So I want to look in terms of the way in which people work, whether the collaboration is stable or evolving. So is this something where every time we do it, it's more or less the same? Or are we in new territory and figuring out how to solve it as well as what to do? And how complex is that interaction? So let me step you through that. We'll start with the simplest of all. If it's simple and stable, we're looking at things like HR request forms, booking meeting rooms, checklists, scheduling a rota of personnel for a shift for the coming week. So these are what I call embedded processes, where we know exactly what the outcome looks like. We do it week in, week out. We know what the rules are, and we can agree those. And there are very few exceptions. So I'm sure you can see that this is ripe for automation. But when that gets a little bit more complex, so we might still know what the outcomes look like, but there's a stronger element of judgment as in we can't necessarily document every rule in advance, and we rely a lot more on people who have perhaps seen this before and can say, yeah, there might be some exceptions here. Here's how we're going to deal with the exception. Then we're into things like surveying, diagnosis, fault finding, maybe health and safety assessments. It might be that most of the time it's done in quite a routine way, but sometimes there'll be things we haven't seen before. So a risk assessment of something like drones, one of the things that's caught out. Prison security is the fact that drones can fly over the exercise yard and drop knives and guns and drugs and things over the wall. A purely embedded process would never catch that exception kind of thing. The third scenario is when it's simple but evolving. So these are things like just asking for information, status updates. It tends to be fairly ad hoc type interactions. So we tend to rely on not actually spelling out what the process is at all, but just by things like emailing back and forth, doing simple coordination. It fits into formal planning. So if you've ever agreed with 7 or 8 people what you're doing on a Friday night, you can pretty much do that with something like a WhatsApp or a Facebook discussion. When it comes to planning a whole weekend away, you'll probably find that the complexity extends beyond doing it like this, and you get into the final quadrant, which is rich collaboration. So rich collaboration is when the outcome is exploratory. We don't necessarily know what the solution is going to look like. There might be a degree of innovation. We might have a couple of false starts before we get to something which is a solution. So anything around product development, maybe launching a new product category or into a new market, service design, system implementation, these are all things that I would call rich collaboration. So there we go. There's the 4 dimensions: expert process, rich collaboration, embedded process, and ad hoc interaction. Now we can start to say, what tools do we map to these? So embedded process is right for doing things like simple forms, workflow. In SharePoint, you can create forms, as in the new forms tool, or we used to do it with custom lists. Status tracking, so just being able to see where is my IT help request ticket, very useful. As it gets more complex, we still can use checklists, and there's a wonderful book called The Checklist Manifesto by a guy called Asu Gawand, and he talked about, for example, how pilots use checklists even in emergency procedures as a way to diagnose, say, engine faults that happen mid-flight. And the reason this is an expert process is because you don't want to be innovating how we solve it. Then you want someone who tells you very definitively what the answer is. But we said there are lots of exceptions for expert processes. So sometimes you see experts who might have, say, Excel macros or customized tools that they put together. Safety inspectors, for example, might put in all the data about a structure and then have something which is their own calculations drawn from research documentation that actually computes advice for the expert about whether it's safe, but it still relies on that expert knowledge to interpret it. Evolving and simple, so this is where messaging comes in. You keep it simple. There's no fixed format for it. And the same for rich collaboration. Because it's not been done before, there's no fixed format. So this is why we tend to fall back on things like Word and Excel and OneNote and even PowerPoint if you have to, because you want to start with a blank canvas. And anything that locks you into a predefined process is probably not going to be fit for purpose of doing something new and innovative. So lastly then, that brings us back to Office 365. If we map the Office 365 tools onto this pattern, embedded processes, Microsoft Forms, Flow is one of the newer tools that might connect different processes together. So it could be if somebody signs up to our newsletter using a form that is on WordPress, then that can trigger a flow that also adds that person to our contact database. As it gets more complex, you might use Nintex and K2 or InfoPath, but really I think those start to come into play for the more complex scenarios, because what Nintex and K2 do very well is have that branching logic to say, if, for example, someone asks for 3 days of leave, then it's a simple yes. But if they ask for 3 weeks of leave, then you need to go into a more detailed check process to see if that's something that you can approve. Other tools that help people visualize data become very powerful. So things like Power BI, again, Excel views using an expert way, not so much to crank the handle and give you an answer, but to inform the expert about what decision to make. So I've worked, for example, a lot with insurance underwriters, and a lot of the insurance requests would go under embedded process. But if you say you want to insure a house with a thatched roof, then it gets referred to the expert to actually ask more probing questions that are not worth building into the system, but do need consideration. For simple and evolving, Skype, OneDrive, Yammer did the kind of chat-based conversational things. Rich collaboration, this is where the Office tools, SharePoint, again, Yammer comes in because you might want a community that helps you solve tricky questions, to pluck out experience from the rest of the organization. And again, Teams, because a lot of what happens might be conversational, and Teams combined with channels, I think, gives you just enough structure to help keep the collaboration being enduring in a way that wouldn't happen if, for example, you just had a chat window open in Skype where everybody was talking in one long single thread. And you'll notice I put Outlook in here as a kind of catch-all. I think every process, no matter what happens, there will be things where you say, look, I can't express it in the form. I'm sending you an email to explain. I've got a question that I don't want everybody to see. I'm sending you an email just one-to-one to have that offline discussion. So hopefully that's helped you think through what you can do across Office 365. We're happy to take any questions in the last minutes, but while you think of your questions, let me just pop up a last poll then, because we'd really appreciate a last bit of feedback. So following today's webinar, are you still confused? Planning to use more elements of Office 365? Clearer on where to store your content? And clearer on which collaboration approaches to use? So you can select more than one of those. Please do go ahead and vote. And if you've got any questions, do put those in the question panel. And again, to remind you, on the right-hand side of GoToWebinar, you'll see a box marked Handouts. You can download the PDFs of the slides right now to refer to. We'll also be putting them on SlideShare, and tomorrow Arzu will be mailing out a link to this recording. Okay, with 52% voted. Okay, I'm going to close the poll as we're running out of time and share the results. So there we go. A little bit of confusion. I'm not surprised. I mean, it's not that Microsoft have provided a very clear and coherent strategy just yet. It's still work in progress, so there's a lot more discussion to be had. But I'm glad to see that 70% of you feel clear on collaboration, 60% clear on where to store your content. So thank you ever so much for joining us. I hope you all have a good day.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.